I've always thought that every person should, at least once, experience moving through life like an F1 driver who just got a Dear John letter. Let me tell you about the time I discovered just how this feels. It was 1986, and I was attending college somewhere between the great cities of Chicago and Milwaukee. It was there that I met a gentleman that we'll simply call Rob. Now, as the saying goes, he wasn't like the rest of us. When my friends and I showed up for school, we arrived in hand-me-down cars made sometime in the last decade. Rob, when he showed up, it was in a new BMW 3 Series. We knew that Rob spoke multiple languages and had just left the Army. One point in time, he showed up with a jacket that had jump wings on the shoulder and suggested he'd once been in Special Forces. I didn't quite believe him, but later circumstances would serve to show me otherwise. When you're the fat kid in school, you have to fight to defend yourself. By the time I reached high school, I had years of martial arts training and practical fighting experience. Rob and I had something in common. Once he discovered I liked to fight, we started sparring constantly. Much to my surprise, I used to win. A lot. Apparently, this impressed Rob. A few months after getting to know him, Rob started taking me on what he called business trips. We would go to a club in Chicago, and I would stand outside a door and make sure that nobody interrupted Rob. At this point, I'd like to point out that I'm indulging in a little youthful naivete. I knew that what Rob was doing was illegal, but on the other hand, I never saw it, and I usually walked away with a $500 to $600, so I'm not going to bitch much about it. Rob and I worked like this for months. Then one day he said, "We're going on a little adventure." What exactly does this adventure entail? We're going to Berlin, Germany. For some reason, the words adventure, danger, foreign country, and potential panic never began to enter into my mind when thinking of Berlin, Germany. I'd never been farther out of my hometown than Quebec. I wanted to see Europe. I wanted to see the world. Rob was my ticket out. So at the appointed date and time, I arrived at O'Hare International Airport and proceeded to take the longest flight of my life. Chicago to New York, New York to London, London to Bonn. When we arrived in Germany, the following happened. We got a couple of huge steins of beer, scored and dropped acid, and got laid. Now, for most people, this would be a very bitchin' trip to Germany. However, I was hanging with Rob. This all happened in the 6 hours we were waiting for our connection to Berlin. By this point, we were pretty much blasted out of our brains on beer and acid. In order to get to Berlin, Rob had arranged for us to take a train through East Germany. Allow me to give future travelers a hint. When traveling through a totalitarian state, especially by train, I recommend you not do it on LSD. Traveling through East Germany in that state was like traveling through the strangest parts of the animation of Pink Floyd's The Wall. All the world turned an odd gray. The trees seemed to have bodies hanging from them, and the wind was peopled with some strange ghosts. When we entered East Germany proper, the Volkspolizei came on board, wanting to see everyone's papers. Now, when you're tripping out of your head on acid, these are not the people you want to see. I remember looking up at this very severe gentleman who was looking down at me and asking to see my papers. He had skulls for eyes. It was the voice of the great poet Hunter S. Thompson saying,
"Ignore this terrible drug,"
that kept me sane, and from spending the rest of my days in an East German prison. We somehow managed to escape that circumstance and arrived in Berlin proper. It was like a breath of fresh air. When I stepped off the train, I almost got down and kissed the ground. We desperately needed to blow off steam. So Rob proceeded to drag me through the city to every place he knew that he said women were looking for something or someone to do. The next morning, or should I say afternoon, we were exhausted from the flight and the drugs. We then went to take care of the business part of the trip. I was not too sure about this part, and Rob had not briefed me on it. We got up and started walking to the part of Berlin where the wall was. I have no idea how it looks now, but back then it was a very bad neighborhood. We kept walking till we came to a particular building and made our way inside to what was an illegal squatter bar. We passed where everybody was drinking and were taken to a back room. There we met two gentlemen, one older, one younger. Rob started talking German to the older one, and the older one started talking back to Rob. Then he turned and started talking to the younger one. The next thing I know, I have a firearm pressed in the side of my neck. I want to point out that this was not on my list of things to be anticipating. I looked to Rob for some cue. Rob looked at me and said, well, I realized that it was now my responsibility and my alone to get myself out of this mess. So I proceeded to do what I'd been told about and been trained, but never actually done. That was to disarm a man who had a firearm pointed at your neck. The trick's quite easy.
First, move your head out of the way. Second, lock the arm. Third, haul off and hit him somewhere that's going to do some damage.
Which I then proceeded to point at the man sitting next to Rob. Rob looked at him, they both looked at me, and started to laugh. I realized it was now part of some strange test. I lowered the gun. Rob handed the man a very large envelope. The man handed Rob a briefcase. We left. We got to the top of the stairs, and I turned to Rob and asked, dude, what was that about? The guy said, you looked young. You wanted to see if your nuts had dropped. Well, why didn't you just tell him they had? I wanted to see if your nuts had dropped. He had a point. I spent the rest of the night ignoring Rob and a long plane flight, forgetting he existed. We got back to Chicago. I drove back to my hometown to chill out. 3 days later, Rob calls me up and says, come on over to my apartment. We've got to hang out. So I headed back over to Rob's place, the entire time trying to think of ways of telling him that I was bailing on his little operation. When I got over to Rob's place, he, without any preamble whatsoever, tosses me a very thick envelope. I open it. Now, in my entire life, I had never seen a $100 bill at this point, let alone an entire envelope 3 inches thick of them, which is when Rob looked at me and said, what you doing Friday? I don't know, man. What you got planned?